Welcome to Newshour. Tonight we examine a deal worth nearly 35 billion euros and the silence that followed. The EU's largest COVID-19 vaccine contract, brokered directly with Pfizer, was meant to guarantee supply and security. But 4 years on and questions about cost, excess stock and vanishing text messages remain unanswered. The European Commission committed to buying 1.8 billion doses at a premium price, €19.50 per shot. Yet by 2023, millions of those had been binned or left unused. The Commission quietly renegotiated, trimming future deliveries, but not before nearly €4 billion in public funds was reportedly lost and wasted. At the heart of the storm is Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who bypassed normal channels to deal directly with Pfizer's CEO. Their messages deleted. A European court has now ruled that was unjustified. Well, tonight we speak to a guest who defends the EU's handling of the pandemic and the vaccine rollout, but with the investigations still active and critics calling this Pfizergate, can procedural shortcuts ever be justified, even in a crisis? Well, let's unpack the facts and the fallout and what transparency really means for Brussels. First, let's take a look at how it all started.
In 2021, as Europe faced a third wave of COVID-19, vaccine access had become both a race and a political pressure point. The European Commission moved to secure a long-term solution, signing its largest ever pharmaceutical contract with Pfizer. The agreement, worth up to 35 billion euros, guaranteed up to 1.8 billion doses of the mRNA vaccine for EU member states. Officials said the aim was to safeguard future supply and prevent another shortage. But what began as a health response has since become a matter of institutional scrutiny. At the centre of the controversy, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's personal involvement in the deal. Rather than leaving talks to procurement officials, she communicated directly with Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla. Text messages between the two were later deleted and never entered into the official record. That absence has triggered a backlash. Transparency advocates argue that such a large public contract should have followed stricter disclosure rules. This month, the EU's top court agreed, ruling the Commission had acted improperly by failing to retrieve and release the messages. Critics have dubbed it Pfizergate, alleging secrecy, mismanagement and a lack of accountability. But Brussels insists the approach was justified. In the face of a public health emergency, speed and direct communication, they argue, were essential. Commission officials maintain that the contract saved lives, helped stabilise vaccine supply across 27 countries and positioned the EU as a leader in global health cooperation. Still, not all doses were used. Millions have since been discarded and questions remain over cost, oversight and whether such extraordinary measures were proportionate. As investigations continue, the EU now faces calls not just for answers, but for reform.
OK, let's cross live now and speak with our correspondent, William Dennislo, in Brussels and get the latest on this from him.
Guy, this has been a controversy that's hung over the European Commission and its President Ursula von der Leyen for several years and has come to be known as Pfizergate. It began when the New York Times requested access to text messages between von der Leyen and Pfizer's CEO Albert Bourla, dating back to 2021. The US outlet argues that those exchanges, dated between January of that year and May 2022, offered insight into the European Union's multi-billion euro procurement of COVID-19 vaccines from the pharmaceutical giant. A lawsuit was subsequently filed in 2023 after the Commission rejected the Times' request, saying President von der Leyen had not kept the messages. On Wednesday, Europe's second top court found that the New York Times succeeded in rebutting the presumption of non-existence and of non-possession of the requested documents. It added that the Commission had not given a plausible explanation to justify the non-possession of the requested documents. The General Court says the Commission now has 2 months to appeal the decision. In response to the ruling, the Commission says transparency has always been of paramount importance to both the institution and its president. In a written statement, the Commission adds that it will study the court's decision and decide on next steps. William Dennislo, A News, Brussels.
Joining me now to unpack these implications is Andy Preston, former mayor of Middlesbrough and now political commentator. Andy, great to see you. Thank you very much for joining us on Newshour. Let's look at the fundamentals of this then. Obviously a very difficult, very unusual time for everyone, not just politicians. Nevertheless, a direct negotiations, direct contact between Ursula von der Leyen and the CEO of Pfizer. Was that appropriate? Was that a wise thing to do?
Hi everyone, hello Guy. You know what? I think that it's against the rules in almost every aspect of government, local, national, international, for politicians to liaise directly with suppliers without there being civil servants present. It's civil servants that actually do the deals. That's the theory anyway. So I think there are big questions to be answered here. But at the same time, we had a genuinely unprecedented global health emergency and nobody knew how that was going to pan out. So I think that many politicians, not just in the EU, in the UK, in the USA and elsewhere, crossed lines, blurred boundaries and took direct action to try and protect people. And I think that it's totally right, Guy, that right now there's an inquiry going on and see what went wrong, if anything. Was there any illegal activity? There's no evidence of that so far, but was there? How do we put this right? That's totally justified. But what I would urge the public to understand and think about is that the context of this was a genuine global emergency that we have got through, but could have been much worse, and nobody knew how bad it was going to be. So politicians were scrabbling to secure the resources to protect their people.
Yeah, it's very clearly it was a very, very unusual time, and we all remember. Do you think, though, that there's a possibility this might point to a wider misjudgment? Critics will often point at the EU and say there's a coziness, a corporate coziness, a sense in which politicians can kind of do what they want, don't have to abide by the same rules as others. Do you think this might be just one symptom of an attitude like that may in places have crept in?
I think that some people will say that, Guy. I think that critics of the EU will point to this, as you've just suggested, and suggest that the EU is this dodgy, chaotic and cosy environment where politicians do what they want and keep the public and democracy out of it. I think that's clearly false, though, because if we look around the world, whether it's the UK, the ruling Conservative Party at the time during COVID was largely pro-Brexit, and many pro-Brexit ministers were involved in scandals of their own about the ordering of PPE and other anti-COVID measures. And similarly, there have been things going on in places like New York, where large amounts of anti-COVID medications and articles were purchased and not used. So these scandals are going on around the world, or the inquiry into them. They happened in 2021. So this definitely isn't just a symptom of the EU. This is a symptom of, in my opinion, the crisis and the urgency with which politicians felt that they had to.
Andy, no problem at all, but let's just go into this. We don't want to over-sensationalise this at all, and we know that this is a similar problem that other politicians have encountered, this problem with messages and this scrutiny, this need to see messages that are exchanged. But if you really look at it, this is not a libertarian leader of a party. This is the President of the European Commission having a direct conversation with one of the most powerful business leaders on the planet, is it really credible that they just forgot to press disappearing messages on their setting? You know, this idea that the messages that are the most contentious just coincidentally are the messages that get lost. Can you understand why people might be suspicious of that?
I can completely understand why the public will be suspicious and really uncomfortable. And you know what? We probably all would be tempted to delete messages. There have been various court cases in the UK, quite high-profile court cases to do with celebrities, where their phones have disappeared when they were supposed to produce evidence of text messages to defend their position in court. And it's a common thing that people want to hide what they may have said in a private conversation. I think the EU leaders, I think politicians at a senior level and all levels shouldn't be hiding messages. They shouldn't be deleting messages. I totally agree. And this will pour petrol on the controversy about secrecy and transparency. Of course it will. At the same time, what I have to say to try and put the other side is that there are rules, and rules are there for very good reasons. In a crisis that's a genuine healthcare emergency where thousands or more people may well die if a politician doesn't act with urgency and determination, I would probably expect that politician to be pragmatic and potentially override the rules that are there. I mean, the issue is with COVID, Guy, is that had the procurement of things like vaccines and PPE gone through the regular channels, the bureaucrats who are there to do a job, and they do it well, but they move very, very slowly. They move incredibly slowly. They move so slowly that almost nothing ever happens. If that had been left to them, the vaccines would not have been procured with the same speed. PPE wouldn't have been procured at the same speed. And if politicians hadn't intervened and pushed the boundaries of the rules, many more people would have died. So I think it's very difficult for senior politicians to act in the public interest and always follow the letter of the law. Sometimes there's a difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. I hope I don't sound like a lawbreaker, but I'm sure you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, and I suppose, as you say, for balance, we should also point out that just because a rule, a protocol is broken, doesn't always mean it's broken for some nefarious reason, or you know that the biggest sort of conspiracy theory is the most likely reason for that rule to be broken. It is interesting though when you mention the UK as an example, because do you think perhaps we may, when we look back at events like COVID, fall into a situation where those politicians who are on the right of politics break a rule and it's seen as very scandalous and morally questionable, but those politicians who are more liberal in their outlook break a rule and it's seen as perfectly understandable and pragmatic?
I think there might be some truth in that. I do think that the media is generally, and the public are generally, a little bit more sympathetic to a left of centre politician and would normally attribute higher moral virtues to them than someone who's on the right. I think that's traditionally the case. And I think the media seems to historically have gone after right-wing politicians more than the left over scandals and things like that. That's the way it appears to me. I think those days are largely gone now. I think the media is about clicks and engagement. So I think that wherever there's a story and there's human interest, it'll be followed with the same degree of enthusiasm. I don't think that the media is now generally right or left centred. I think it's after engagement and clicks. So that and engagement and clicks are largely ideologically blind, in my opinion.
And let's move this back to Ursula von der Leyen herself. I mean, I've been talking this morning to journalists in Brussels and analysts, and she's not a universally popular figure. There are obviously those people that support her, but there may be potentially, do you think, a problem with her connecting with voters, with the public, emotionally perhaps? And has this harmed her, do you think, in any way? And if so, how does she repair that damage and win back any trust rather that may have been eroded?
So there are different audiences, aren't there, Guy? I mean, I think that when it comes to the general public, I think the general public are really removed from people like Ursula von der Leyen. I think that the senior European politicians are so far removed from the everyday stuff that people see in the streets, like the potholes that need fixing, or the rubbish isn't collecting, or the perceptions of the issue of immigration or crime in their street. And it's their MP or equivalent, and their city mayor or equivalent, that is the focal point for those issues. When it becomes more about the EU and much higher levels or tiers of government, I think there's a distancing between voters and the politician. So I don't think that lack of connection is going to make much difference. This story will make much difference to that. It may make a difference to some politicians and how they perceive her, but truthfully, I think that those who supported her and shared her ideologies and approaches will see that she's done nothing wrong, and those that see her as a foe and disagree with her will see this as evidence of her being no good. So will this really damage her? I don't think so. Has it damaged politics? It probably has a bit, because any headline that suggests or implies a politician has deleted texts sounds dodgy. But I have to ask you actually, Guy, because I'm not sure I've seen anything that's confirmed that she has deleted. I think the message was, or the indication was, that they were irretrievable. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the things that I was going to discuss with you, Andy, was whether she should now come out and give a categoric statement about technically what took place and what had happened with the message, because the rumours across social media are so rife now, and of course everybody thinks the worst, believes the worst. It's the most attractive message to get clicks and attract attention on social media. Do you think she should come out and be specific about exactly what happened with those messages?
So should she come out and give a statement clarifying exactly what did and didn't happen? Okay, let me wear two hats. If I was her ethics advisor, I would say to her that she should do that, absolutely. She should be transparent and come out and make a statement and put everything right, and maybe there's a bit of heat, but at least she's been honest and on the front foot. If I was her PR advisor, I would say just keep quiet. This story will move on. It hasn't really touched large numbers of the general public, and nor will it unless she personally elevates the story with a statement. So while I think she probably should morally and ethically, certainly, PR-wise, I would advise her not to.
I just want to go back to some of that you mentioned about the possible detachment of European politicians from normal people, let's say, for want of a better expression, in the EU countries. Is there any sense in which the task of reforming the EU in response to the rise of right-wing populism, in response to Brexit, criticism the EU has faced, has that reform really gathered the momentum that you would have hoped?
No, I don't think it has. I still think there is this big distance psychologically and effectively from European level politicians and people on the street in Hamburg or Marseille or Brussels. And I suspect, Guy, that is always going to be the way of it. Like, genuinely, as a city mayor, what I would say is the things that people really care about are the national headlines to do with their country when there is scandal or fear. But most of the time, all they care about is what's happening in their street. The bins being collected, potholes, is there crime? Is the school any good? They're the things that really irk people and they care about. As soon as you get beyond the everyday things, people get very confused as to who is responsible for what and who does what role. Even at a national level, that happens. So I think it's going to be very tough, whoever's in power, and whatever efforts the EU makes to actually engage with the largely disengaged public. I don't think that chasm can ever be bridged.
And just finally, Andy, I know that business is an area that you also monitor very, very closely. One of the challenges that Ursula von der Leyen has been to try and respond to criticism from business and economists that there is something about the approach to regulation, something about the EU's attitude towards competitiveness that has been partially at least responsible for a lack of growth in the region. Now, we saw in response to that, the Commission President launched an initiative called the Competitiveness Compass. Some critics have sort of said, well, that just sounds like, consultancy gobbledygook. Others have said, no, it's actually quite a sensible way of streamlining policy. What's your view on the work that's been done and the work that needs to be done when it comes to increasing competition and innovation in the EU?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that the EU is a bureaucratic, left of centre, cautious level of government, and I don't think that they can change their DNA. I do not believe it. So whereas they may come up with slogans that sound a bit like Alan Partridge has invented them, I do not believe that will make any difference. I think that you are spot on when you say that a relaxing of rules, an easing of restrictions boosts business, makes business more efficient, makes it more profitable, generates more growth, and ultimately more tax revenues for the government, so they can do great things with it, like build schools and roads and look after people. Of course there is a balance. Of course there's a balance where there have to be checks and balances. Companies have to be kept in check. The pursuit of profit at the expense of public safety and the expense of what's good in the medium term absolutely needs to be regulated. Do I think the EU is probably too bureaucratic and regulates a bit too much? I would say yes, it does. And I would say that its rules and regulations, the infrastructure and the ideology that it has, largely comes from an era from the 60s to the 90s when growth was stronger, tax revenues into government were strong, infrastructure could be built out. This new lower growth environment, which I think the EU is stuck in for the foreseeable future, means that regulations and rules have to now be relaxed to free up the spirit of free enterprise and try and drive more growth. That will come at a cost, but I think it's a necessary move.
A necessary move. Very, very interesting to speak to you as always, Andy. Thanks so much for joining us again on Newshour.
Thank you, Guy.
Okay, that is all for this edition of Newshour. The EU may have delivered vaccines at record pace, but it now finds itself fighting a different kind of infection, one of mistrust. As courts push for answers and public pressure mounts, the question remains, was it urgency or opacity that drove this deal? I'm Guy Shone, and from all of us here at A News, see you next time.